A community is rocked when an ambitious young woman is found dead in a hotel room.
She had been shot in the back of the head.
She was executed in cold blood.
Things don't happen like that in the town of Charlotte.
At first glance, the suspect list is long.
She was actually a correctional officer.
She was very serious about her job.
Is this tied into her job? I got a feeling that was the case.
But as the investigation unfolds, suspicions shift.
Maybe if his wife had gotten wind of this relationship.
You're the only person that can tell me what happened.
She was playing both of them.
If he can't have her, then no one could.
And her killer has no intention of facing justice.
He was not going back to jail.
There were over 100 guns in his home.
He wanted to go out with a blaze of glory.
It was all a game from the beginning.
July 20th, 2020. It's Monday morning in Navassa, North Carolina. A small town just across the Cape Fear River from Wilmington.
It's a relatively small community in Brunswick County.
Population with about 2,000 to 3,000 people.
It's 95% African American, about 3% white and 2% Hispanic. But most of all, Navassa was a really nice place to live.
But this morning, one Navassa native, 23-year-old Kiana Graham, has gone missing.
Kiana worked as a correctional officer at the Pender Correctional Institution.
She was scheduled to work a mandatory overtime shift the night before.
But her mother gets a call saying that Kiana didn't come to work.
She was a newer employee, but she was a good employee.
The girl was always punctual, always on time, always where she's supposed to be.
This was very rare for her not to show up to work.
When Kiana's worried mother calls her, she gets no response.
This is Kiana, call me back.
Hey, Kiana, why are you not picking up the phone?
Kiana lived with her mother. They were always in touch. And when she wasn't at work, she always picked up her phone.
This is just out of her habit, just to disappear and not let her mother know where she was.
A voice in the back of her head is telling her that something is terribly wrong.
Kiana was a young female working at this facility.
Her mother always had it in her head that working at a prison like this wasn't safe.
So she was nervous and she called the police to try to help her locate her daughter.
I need to file a missing persons report.
To everyone who knew her, Kiana Graham was a bright light.
She was a free spirit, easygoing, just loved people.
She was very likable, just a nice, giving, and caring person.
She and her mother were extremely close.
She was greatly loved.
She was very family-oriented.
And she was highly focused. After graduating high school, Kiana entered the workforce.
She worked at this home to help people with mental disabilities.
She was an avid worker.
But as much as she loved her job, it wasn't paying the bills.
She was living with her mom because cost of living is very high.
To gain her independence, Kiana knew she needed a better paying job.
She was taking classes to become a correction officer.
After completing her training, Kiana landed a great position at the Pender Correctional Institution.
She was really excited about being a corrections officer, getting a steady job.
She was a great employee and she was a hard worker.
She had a bright future ahead of her.
But as secure as her work life seemed, Kiana's love life was more of a work in progress.
Kiana had been with Xavion Marshall in a long-term on-again and off-again relationship since high school.
For 23-year-olds, it's not abnormal to have an on and off again relationship, but there was no evidence that there was a lack of love there.
At the same time, Kiana struck up a friendship with an older local man named Michael Hill.
Michael was in his 50s, Kiana was in her early 20s.
He played a role as a mentor in her life, often giving her advice.
Which wasn't surprising, given that Mike was a pillar of the community.
He was pretty well known since he had grown up in Brunswick County.
He lived a good life. He had a good job.
And then a few years ago, he hit the lottery, literally.
He was actually known in the community as Money Mike since he won $10 million off of a scratch-off ticket.
But Michael's newfound wealth didn't fundamentally change his character.
All he ever wanted was a fishing boat and a pickup truck, and he did buy that for himself.
He spent $200,000 paying off his home.
But he had spent everything else on the community. He had bought four-wheelers for kids in his neighborhood, bought vehicles for people. He gave some to the church.
He was known to be very philanthropic and give back.
Kiana respected his strong values and shared an interest in his laid-back lifestyle.
She enjoyed doing the simple things with him.
Well, they go fishing, they go hunting.
As the two grew closer, Kiana also counted on Michael for relationship advice.
It just really feels like he's always playing games.
He probably is.
She would often lean on Michael for advice with Xavion.
Some men are like that. But not all of us, though.
Then one day, when Kiana and Xavion were on a break, her relationship with Michael took an unexpected turn.
They started an intimate relationship.
They really enjoyed each other's company, so they just kind of kept with it.
But now, Kiana's mother has called police to report her missing.
Hey, I'm Chief Howell. I went out to Miss Graham's house and talked to Miss Graham about her daughter.
She told him that she received the phone call from her job. That's when she began to worry.
For her not to show up, that was very alarming.
And she was not answering her phone.
She knew this was not normal. Her mother said she never hardly missed work unless she was like deathly ill. She was thinking something happened to Kiana, that she wasn't just missing.
Well, why do you think that?
She's a correction officer.
She was working in a facility that housed criminals. Her focus was that someone in the facility could possibly do her harm.
And Chief Howell is thinking the exact same thing.
Is this tied into her job? Is she missing because somebody she had in prison had come and kidnapped her? I got a feeling that was the case.
"23-year-old Kiana Graham was enjoying spending time with 52-year-old lottery winner Michael Hill.
There was a very big age gap between the two of them, but Kiana was very much so into Michael.
Kiana really enjoyed doing the simple things with him.
But now, Kiana's mother has reported her missing, and police fear the worst.
She was a correctional officer.
That type of position, it lends itself to being in harm's way.
One of the inmates, originally under Kiana's supervision, could have gotten out and targeted her for revenge, money, or in a sexual crime.
Concerned, Chief Howell immediately tries to locate this young woman.
Let me make a call.
I did a missing person report, and I had the sheriff's office try to ping her phone. The phone was not on.
Given that Kiana is in law enforcement, the stakes are high. So Chief Howell calls in the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation.
I said, look, guys, I need your help. I got this missing girl. She's a correction officer. She just vanished off the face of the earth. And they said, okay, we'll come down and assist you.
In the meantime, Kiana's mother fills the chief in on Kiana's plans the day before.
When you start talking about a guy she'd been dating, Mike Hill.
Mom knew Michael Hill from the community and had seen him with Kiana. She knew that there was some type of relationship there.
She said she was supposed to meet him the previous afternoon before work.
My captain was good friends with Mike, and Mike would come stop by the PD sometime to see him, and that's how I met Mike. I didn't know him good enough to know that he was dating Kiana, but he seemed to be a nice guy, seemed to be personable.
Well, did you talk to him before you realized Kiana was missing?
Yes.
Kiana's mother called him.
Have you talked to her?
She called asking him if he had seen Kiana.
She's not answering it.
Michael told her mother that he didn't know what was going on or where she was.
But Michael Hill isn't the only man in Kiana's life.
Kiana was in an on-again, off-again relationship since high school with Xavion.
Police need to talk to both men. Michael can't be reached, so the chief makes a call to Xavion.
But they gotta run it through all the questions and really get to the bottom of the situation.
When asked if he knew where Kiana could be, he says no.
I talked to Xavion on the phone that morning. He said he hadn't seen her or talked to her.
While the investigator may harbor doubts about his story, the case is about to take a tragic turn.
I was still doing follow-ups.
But then, the chief gets a call from dispatch.
This is Chief Howell.
But they had found a deceased female in a hotel in Charlotte.
And she was face down on the bed in a pool of blood.
When looking at the ID, they were able to identify the body as Kiana.
Okay, thank you.
Chief Howell is charged with the difficult task of breaking the news to Kiana's mother.
We told her that her daughter had been found and was deceased.
She was devastated. That's her little girl, and she's gone now.
I really felt bad for her. Her mother's really, really good, nice people. Kiana was too.
The Navassa police chief remains with Kiana's mother, while a Charlotte detective and North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation agent begin their examination of the crime scene.
Kiana was found in bed with her head face down.
It was pretty chilling, just the way she was laying there.
You could clearly see that there was a large hole in the back of her head.
She had been shot, and it appeared she was asleep or falling asleep and likely didn't see it coming. It was basically like an execution.
When they turn her over, a .45 projectile comes out of her mouth.
But there was no gun at the scene. It seemed that she had been deceased for a while.
One thing found inside the room points to a potential suspect.
Along with Kiana's ID, there was a second ID with a name, Xavion Marshall.
That's when Chief Howell arrives at the scene.
He shares some information with them.
Kiana's mother had told him more about her boyfriend, Michael Hill.
Michael Hill isn't just Kiana's boyfriend.
He is currently married as well.
Police in Charlotte, North Carolina have only begun to investigate the complicated murder case of 23-year-old Kiana Graham.
At first, police thought she had been targeted because of her job as a correction officer. But now, they aren't so sure.
Check this out.
Inside her hotel room, they found the driver's license of a man named Xavion Marshall.
Chief Howell, who had questioned Kiana's mother, was able to tell them that he was an on-again, off-again boyfriend of Kiana's. But that isn't all. He also reveals that Kiana was dating a man named Michael Hill,
which immediately leads police to consider a possible motive.
There might have been a love triangle.
But the plot thickens because Michael is also a married man.
Did Michael's wife find out about his affair and relationship with Kiana? Did she want revenge?
Investigators hope requesting the hotel surveillance footage will provide some answers.
The hotel had a video system.
They were pulling all of the surveillance footage to see if anyone came in and out of the room.
In the meantime, police confirm the hotel room was registered to Michael Hill.
At this point, it is now their #1 priority to find Michael Hill.
As police try to locate him, news of the murder spreads through Charlotte.
It's a small community, low crime area. People are close. That murder really shook the town of Charlotte.
So as soon as detectives track Michael down, they bring him in for questioning.
He was calm and cool.
They started by asking him about his relationship with Kiana.
They want him to paint a picture of what their relationship was like.
He's just a straight shooter. He just owns up to it, totally.
Her and Mr. Hill had an ongoing, on and off again, romantic relationship.
How long have you guys been off and on now?
About a year and a half.
Yeah.
Year and a half.
The affair actually started when he and his wife, Jackie, were going through tough times.
Michael describes his relationship with Kiana as a breath of fresh air.
She was a really nice person. He said that they enjoyed doing many things together and just living a simple life.
And he said that she was one of the few people in his life who didn't want to run his pockets.
Sound like you really loved her.
I was in love with her.
The investigators wonder if Kiana felt the same way.
She swore down she was in love with me.
Though Michael admits one thing made him doubt the sincerity of Kiana's feelings: her relationship with Xavion Marshall.
She would only reach out, according to Michael, when she was on the outs with Xavion.
Have they been on the outs recently?
Yeah, they be. The whole reason we even got together this particular time, but she was like, I don't know, I might give him a chance. I'm like, why would you even go running back to this guy? I said, she was since high school. But then she'd be like, he get on my nerves.
And even then, she never completely cut Xavion off.
Kiana was still communicating with Xavion, chatting on and off again through social media platforms,
which caused a lot of the tension with Mr. Hill.
He just got really, really tired of it.
After that, I was like, man, you love that guy. You might as well just go ahead and do it.
Finally, Michael says he gave Kiana an ultimatum.
It was coming to a point where it's like, listen, you are my lady. And this other guy, Xavion, he needs to get out of the picture.
But Michael says Kiana refused to commit. So 3 weeks ago, he'd ended the relationship.
Sound like Kiana just didn't know what she wanted.
Kiana, it's a mixed bag because I don't know if she know what she wants.
he couldn't deal with it anymore.
That's it, I'm done.
After that, Michael claims he had no contact with Kiana until Sunday.
She texted him saying that she missed him and she really wanted to see him. And he told her that they could get together the next day.
According to Michael, he agreed to make a reservation for them at a hotel.
This was something that they often did.
You check in around 10:30, then you go wait in the parking lot. She shows up around 11:30. You guys go in.
They'd meet up and just enjoyed each other.
Michael said he stayed with Kiana as long as he could, but when he left, she stayed at the hotel.
Her plan was to get some shut-eye before she had to go to work that night.
So detectives need to determine what time Michael left the hotel.
Yesterday I want to say about 2-something. About 2-something yesterday.
And he says that when he left, Kiana was alive and well.
Michael said he didn't know that anything was wrong until he got a phone call from Kiana's mother asking where her daughter was.
Michael is taken aback because Kiana said she was gonna go to sleep and go to work.
Once again, he told Kiana's mother that he had no idea where she was.
But it wasn't long after that he received a call from a friend with shocking news.
From who? This friend of mine called me and said, man, do you realize that they found Kiana dead? Who do you think could have done this? I don't know, man. I don't know, man. Did you kill her, Mom? I didn't kill her.
In fact, he insists investigators are barking up the wrong tree.
Michael explains the guy you probably want to be talking to is Xavion. Kiana had told him he was crazy.
In Charlotte, North Carolina, Michael Hill, the boyfriend of murder victim Kiana Graham, has told police she was afraid of the other man she was seeing, Xavion Marshall.
On one particular occasion, she contacted Michael to let him know that she was concerned because Xavion was stalking her.
And he asked Kiana, do you need me to come and handle this situation, come get you? She's like, no.
I'm on the phone with her. I said, listen, man. I said, I can call somebody. She said, no. I said, do you want me to come over there? She said, no, it don't make things worse.
But Michael says that recently, things had worsened between Kiana and Xavion.
He says just days earlier, Xavion wouldn't let her out of the car during the argument.
He said Kiana actually had to call the police on Xavion.
Week before last, she called me. She said, you know, I called the police on him the other day, right? Because he wouldn't let me out my car. I said, what?
Could Xavion have followed Kiana to the hotel and killed her?
Maybe Xavion found out about Kiana and Michael and came to the hotel and in a jealous rage, killed her.
There is already evidence Xavion may have been there.
They found Xavion's ID in her purse.
And he could have easily learned she was there for a tryst with Michael.
Do you own any guns or?
The country boy. Everybody owns guns.
He said Xavion, being a country boy, he carried weapons just like himself.
But investigators can't be sure Michael is telling the truth about Xavion.
Maybe Michael's wife has gotten wind of this relationship. Maybe she is the one who committed this crime.
Does she know anything about that?
He immediately cuts them off.
Michael informed the officers that his wife didn't know about Kiana.
He was sure that she had nothing to do with this.
But detectives wonder, was Michael's wife as in the dark as he claimed?
Police have to do their job.
Investigators go to the home Michael shares with his wife Jackie to question her.
Hi, can I help you?
She told him that she knew Kiana from around town, but didn't know her personally.
And Jackie definitely didn't know that her husband was sleeping with her.
Excuse me?
She said she knew absolutely nothing about the relationship between Michael and Kiana.
She is completely just blown away at this news that her husband is cheating on her. And as well, this situation involves his mistress being murdered.
And with that,
thank you for your time.
She has no motive to be the perpetrator of this crime.
Detectives were able to rule out Jackie.
But before police can make their next move, a friend of Kiana's named Carol comes forward with what might be a break in the case.
She says, look, if anybody is doing any stalking, it wasn't Xavion, it was Michael.
She says that Michael often threatened Kiana.
And she even heard Michael say, if I can't have you, nobody can.
In Charlotte, North Carolina, a friend of Kiana Graham's has just told detectives that Kiana had an abusive relationship with Michael Hill.
It was a textbook domestic violence relationship. He was manipulative, he was jealous.
He became pretty much a control freak over this young woman.
He bought her clothes that he wanted her to wear. He wanted to know where she was, who her friends were, and where she went.
Oftentimes, Kiana would ignore his calls, but he found some way to contact her. He would call from other numbers.
He was physically stalking this woman.
And what Carol tells police wasn't just hearsay. Michael had come after her and Kiana's other friends, too.
We tried to get them to break up.
When her friends were encouraging her to walk away from the relationship, Michael would often threaten the friend group, and she oftentimes saw Michael with a gun.
There were times when Carol had also heard Michael directly threaten Kiana.
He said he was going to kill her if she didn't leave her boyfriend.
But Carol admits she never saw nor heard Kiana complain of physical abuse.
This case was an important domestic violence case because it wasn't physical abuse that led to Kiana's death. It was emotional.
That's very dangerous. When they're controlling your every move, you have an issue.
And when investigators are finally able to review the security footage from the hotel, they are all but certain Michael is her killer.
They were able to see Michael on camera.
He was the only person who came in and out of that room before Miss Graham was found.
With probable cause, detectives get a warrant for his arrest.
They also get a search warrant to check out his house.
Michael isn't there, but his wife lets police inside.
She was very helpful, but you could really see in her face that she could not believe that Mike had killed Kiana.
Inside, detectives find an arsenal of guns belonging to Michael.
They found over 100 guns.
More confident than ever, detectives use cell phone tracking data to pinpoint their suspect's location.
They tracked his phone to Southport. He was at the waterfront.
Worried he could be armed and dangerous, investigators employ a secret weapon. Chief Deputy Charlie Miller.
He knew Mr. Hill from the community.
They grew up together, actually several houses down from each other.
He actually approached Mr. Hill first since he knew him.
I'm sorry, man, but you're under arrest.
He doesn't resist, he doesn't give him any problems, he lets them take him on in.
We're very grateful that he is the one that found him.
Especially because inside Michael's truck, there's evidence this could have ended differently.
He had several firearms loaded at the time.
One was a pistol and one was the assault rifle.
We believe that he was planning suicide by a cop.
Continuing our coverage tonight.
News of the arrest shakes this small community.
When people started learning about what happened to her, there was a lot of people that were really upset and having a hard time with this.
For him to kill her because he was jealous and had no control over her at that point was horrific.
Face to face with detectives, Michael continues to insist on his innocence.
He still denies it. He says he didn't kill Kiana.
That's when investigators confront him with the video evidence against him.
They say, look, you're the only person we see who had gone in and out of that room.
You're the only person that can tell me what happened in that room to the woman he loves.
His whole demeanor changed.
Mr. Hill sort of put his head down and sighed and then began to tell the truth of what actually happened.
You expect things to change, and then you wake up, figure it all out, all the games from the beginning.
Michael resented Kiana. He was willing to walk away from his wife, who was a loving woman, to be with her.
And I really fell in love with her. I fell in love with her. But she wasn't in love with nobody. Really? Yeah.
She was telling him that she was in love with him. Yet he would oftentimes find her communicating with Xavion in his presence.
He was very jealous. He felt like Kiana was playing him.
And though Michael previously told police Kiana wasn't after his money, he now claimed she was.
How much money you think you spending tomorrow? A lot. A whole lot.
Of course, without Kiana there to defend herself, and with Michael suddenly changing his story to paint her as a gold digger, we can't know what the real truth is.
But Michael makes it clear that the day of the murder, his resentment against Kiana for continuing the relationship with Xavion boiled over.
He got upset because she was talking with him on her phone. They had a few words about it.
That's really none of your business.
The hell it ain't.
She told him they were finished talking about him, and told him she was going to lay down and go to sleep. She had to go to work at 6 o'clock.
Michael was angry and he was hurt.
He was beginning to unravel at this point.
I got up, I said, I'm going to smoke a cigar. She said, whatever, just make sure you cut the lights off. I don't know, I guess just touched something in it. I reached down in my book bag, pulled out the 45, reached over the shower.
52-year-old lottery winner Michael Hill has just confessed to shooting his 23-year-old girlfriend, Kiana Graham, in a jealous rage over her talking to her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Xavion Marshall.
He got upset because he felt like she was talking with him. Then she was going to sleep and told him to turn the lights off. He pulled out the 45 that he had in his bag and he shot her in the back of the head.
She did not have an opportunity to fight back.
She never saw it coming.
Did you check the 6 years date? I didn't even look at it. I didn't look.
He grabbed his things and he walked out of the hotel room.
Fleeing the scene, Michael was sure he'd be stopped.
There were people in the hallway. However, they must not have heard the noise or thought it was something else.
Michael says he immediately went to dispose of the gun.
Where'd you throw it out again? Down in the river.
He went down a dirt road in Navassa and threw the gun into the Cape Fear River there.
After that, Michael says he couldn't face going home.
He said he drove around
and he spent the night in his truck.
Then he hatched a plan.
Michael explained he had been in prison before.
In the 80s and 90s, he had been convicted of some property crimes and a robbery.
I'm not going back to prison. So I can't live in prison.
So he went and bought firearms as part of his suicide by cop plan.
He was planning to jump out of his vehicle with a firearm and pray that the police would shoot and kill him. But when he saw Charlie Miller, he said he couldn't do that to his friend and gave up without incident.
It could have been a much worse situation. We're very grateful that it ended the way it did.
Continuing to build their case against Michael, investigators try to locate the murder weapon.
Brunswick County Sheriff's Office come out and assist with a dive team. Those deputies and those officers dove 3 or 4, maybe even 5 times trying to locate the firearm.
But they were unable to locate it.
On July 21st, 2020, Michael is charged with first-degree murder.
An element of first-degree murder is that there has to be premeditation.
Michael claims that he killed Kiana in the heat of the moment. It wasn't planned, but premeditated murder is not just the act of planning it out, but also thinking about it.
Michael Hill in the past said that he was going to kill her if she didn't leave her boyfriend.
So the prosecutor in this situation believed that first-degree murder was appropriate.
With Michael behind bars, the community mourns Kiana's loss.
There was a lot of love and support for Kiana. She had a good-sized funeral.
As the case moves to trial, Michael surprises everyone by enlisting a public defender.
It was a shock given that he won the lottery in 2017.
He won $10 million.
Once taxes are taken out of it, it's more than $4 million.
He had actually spent a lot of that money, and he gave a lot of it away.
Though Michael hopes to negotiate a plea, prosecutors insist on taking the case to trial.
We believe that was the appropriate thing to do because essentially Kiana was executed in cold blood, and we did not feel he deserved anything less than life.
In May of 2022, when Michael's trial opens in a Brunswick County courtroom, it opens old wounds for Kiana's family.
Her family was present at the trial. Trials are always difficult for victims of homicide. They have to hear all the evidence of how the homicide occurred. That can be extremely difficult.
In front of the jury, the prosecution paints Kiana's murder as a classic case of domestic violence.
Michael was very possessive, and this was a woman he wanted to completely control. And if he could not, he was going to kill her, and that's what he did.
Though Michael may not have initially planned Kiana's murder that day, he made a conscious decision to kill her after an alleged betrayal.
They had got into an argument. She wouldn't leave her boyfriend, and he said he just got fed up and shot her.
To prove Michael's guilt, the prosecution presents overwhelming evidence.
They first called Kiana's friend Carol to the stand.
She talked about her relationship with Mr. Hill, how he was controlling, how he was jealous, how they were concerned for her safety, and he had threatened to kill her at one point. We watched surveillance footage where they discovered Mr. Hill was the only one who went in and out of that room. And then we subsequently interviewed him for several hours about what had happened. And he had confessed to the entire homicide.
Given the facts, it's no surprise when the jury returns with a guilty verdict.
He was found guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Although Kiana's family is satisfied with the verdict, no punishment will ever be enough.
There's really no justice that can bring back the life of an individual.
She was cheated out of a whole lot, and her family and friends were cheated out of the opportunity to see what she would become down the road.
She'll be missed in the community and is missed to this day.
In the autumn of 1977, Los Angeles was a city of contradictions. Under the warm California sun, postcards promised palm trees, endless freeways, Hollywood glamour, and the illusion that opportunity waited around every corner. Millions of people came searching for new beginnings. Actors chased impossible dreams. College students built futures they could barely imagine. Families believed they had found a safer life beneath the clear skies of Southern California. But as daylight gave way to evening, another version of Los Angeles slowly emerged. It was a city where neighborhoods changed from block to block, where thousands of strangers crossed paths every hour without exchanging a single word, and where darkness provided anonymity to those who wanted to disappear into it. By October of that year, something had begun stalking those streets. At first, no one recognized a pattern. A young woman vanished. Days later, her body was discovered on a remote hillside. Investigators treated the case as another isolated homicide in a city already overwhelmed by violent crime. Then another woman disappeared. Another body was found. Soon another. The locations were different. The victims came from different backgrounds, yet the endings were hauntingly similar. Before long, newspapers needed a name for the unseen figure responsible. They called the killer the Hillside Strangler. It was a name that carried both mystery and fear. It suggested a single predator hiding somewhere among the sprawling hills overlooking Los Angeles, choosing victims almost at random before abandoning their bodies far from the places where they had last been seen alive. The name spread quickly through television broadcasts, newspaper headlines, and conversations around dinner tables. Parents warned their daughters not to travel alone after sunset. Friends stopped accepting rides from strangers. Some women began refusing evening shifts at work. Others changed their daily routines entirely. Fear became part of ordinary life. Yet perhaps the most unsettling aspect of those first months was not what investigators knew. It was what they believed they knew. Detectives were convinced they were searching for one offender. Every crime scene, every witness statement, every piece of evidence was examined through that assumption. Somewhere, they believed one man was responsible for all of it. They did not realize that the truth was far more disturbing. Long before the investigation reached its conclusion, the answer had already slipped past them countless times. Because the Hillside Strangler was never one man. It was two. Looking back today, with decades of hindsight and thousands of pages of investigative records available for study, it is tempting to imagine that the warning signs should have been obvious. There were moments when witnesses described details that did not perfectly fit the theory of a lone killer. There were questions that seemed difficult to answer if only one person was involved. Yet investigations rarely unfold with the clarity that history later provides. Detectives in 1977 were working without modern DNA analysis. They depended on fingerprints, witness testimony, forensic examinations, and painstaking detective work. Every new homicide demanded immediate attention. Every false lead consumed precious time. Every incorrect assumption shaped the direction of the next decision. As the bodies continued to appear across Los Angeles, the pressure mounted from every direction. The media demanded answers. Families pleaded for justice. Politicians questioned why so many women could disappear without anyone identifying the person responsible. More investigators joined the task force. More interviews were conducted. More evidence was collected. Yet the identity of the killer remained hidden behind a carefully maintained illusion. The fear spreading across Los Angeles was unlike anything many residents had experienced before. It was not simply that women were disappearing. It was that no one understood who was truly at risk. The first known victims led investigators to believe the murders were focused on sex workers. While tragic, the pattern appeared limited. Then a teenage high school student became one of the victims. Soon afterward, two young girls vanished after leaving to watch a movie. Suddenly, every previous assumption collapsed. Age no longer mattered. Occupation no longer mattered. The victims were no longer connected by lifestyle, but only by vulnerability. Every woman walking alone became a potential target. Every family with daughters wondered whether they would return safely at the end of the day. Rumors spread almost as quickly as facts. Some claimed the killer drove an unmarked police vehicle. Others insisted he wore a uniform. Stories changed with every retelling, but one constant remained. No one knew who could be trusted. That uncertainty created a different kind of terror. Criminals were expected to hide in shadows. Police officers represented safety. But what if someone pretending to be law enforcement used that trust as a weapon? Even the possibility forced people to question instincts they had relied upon their entire lives. Los Angeles became a city where ordinary encounters suddenly carried new risks. The investigation grew into one of the largest homicide efforts California had seen at the time. More than 160 investigators worked thousands of leads. Every reported sighting, every anonymous telephone call, every possible suspect had to be examined. Detectives searched for patterns among the crime scenes. They compared timelines. They reviewed witness statements repeatedly, hoping some overlooked detail might finally reveal the identity of the hillside strangler. Despite all of those efforts, the investigation appeared trapped in place. The killer always seemed one step ahead. Bodies were left in different locations across the hills surrounding Los Angeles, making it difficult to reconstruct movements or establish a predictable hunting ground. There were no matching fingerprints in police databases. No forensic technology existed that could provide the answers modern investigators might expect. Today, every breakthrough seemed to lead only to another dead end. While the investigation struggled, life continued across Southern California. Freeways remained crowded. Schools stayed open. Businesses welcomed customers every morning. Tourists still arrived hoping to glimpse the famous Hollywood sign or walk along the beaches that had made California famous around the world. Yet beneath that appearance of normality, anxiety lingered. Parents checked clocks more often while waiting for children to come home. Friends insisted on accompanying one another after dark. Women altered travel routes, changed work schedules, or simply stayed home whenever possible. Fear had quietly reshaped daily life without asking anyone's permission. History often remembers notorious criminal cases because of the people who committed them. But the true story always belongs elsewhere. It belongs to those whose futures were stolen and to the families forced to live with unanswered questions. Before this case became known through books, documentaries, and court records, it consisted of ordinary lives interrupted without warning. Young women with families, students with ambitions, individuals who expected tomorrow to arrive just like any other day. Instead, their disappearances became headlines, their names became evidence files, and their loved ones found themselves waiting for answers that seemed increasingly impossible to obtain. The Hillside Strangler investigation would eventually reveal one of the most shocking truths in American criminal history. It would expose not a solitary predator, but two cousins working together. It would include an arrest hundreds of miles away in another state, an extraordinary attempt to avoid responsibility through a fabricated claim of multiple personalities, and one of California's longest and most complicated murder trials. But none of that was visible during those first terrifying months. At the beginning, all anyone knew was that women were disappearing, bodies were appearing on lonely hillsides, and somewhere within one of America's largest cities. Evil had found a way to hide in plain sight. That is where this story begins, not with the capture of two killers, not with courtroom testimony, and not with the headlines that would eventually define the case, but with a frightened city searching desperately for one monster, while never imagining that two were already watching from the darkness. As the investigation slowly gathered momentum, one painful reality became impossible to ignore. The victims connected to the case that newspapers had begun calling the work of the Hillside Strangler did not fit neatly into a single profile. Detectives initially hoped that identifying a common characteristic among the victims would narrow the search, allowing them to predict who might be targeted next or where the offender might strike again. Instead, each new discovery challenged the assumptions made after the previous one. The women whose lives were taken differed in age, background, and circumstance. Some were adults trying to survive difficult lives. Others were teenagers with futures that had barely begun. 2 were young girls whose disappearance shattered any remaining belief that the killer, or killers, followed a predictable pattern. Rather than seeing them as statistics or evidence files, it is important to remember that each victim was an individual whose life extended far beyond the brief details recorded in police reports. Every name represented someone who had family, memories, routines, and hopes that were suddenly and violently interrupted. Their stories became linked only because of the crimes committed against them, not because of who they were. The first victim later identified as part of the series was 19-year-old Yolanda Washington. She disappeared on October 16, 1977. Washington worked as a sex worker, and when her body was discovered on a hillside near Ventura Boulevard, investigators initially viewed the case through the lens of crimes frequently committed against vulnerable women living on society's margins. Tragically, violence against sex workers was not uncommon, and detectives first believed the murder might be unrelated to any larger pattern. At that stage, there was little reason to imagine that her death marked the beginning of one of California's most infamous serial murder investigations. Only after later discoveries would investigators recognize that Washington's murder had been the first confirmed crime in what would become known as the Hillside Strangler case. Just over 2 weeks later, 24-year-old Rosamond Williams was murdered. Like Washington, Williams also worked as a sex worker. Her body was found discarded near a highway, reinforcing the belief that the offender specifically targeted women involved in prostitution. Detectives began considering whether the killer selected victims based on occupation rather than opportunity. If that assumption proved correct, perhaps other women would be spared. Unfortunately, the next case destroyed that theory completely. 15-year-old Judith Miller disappeared after leaving school on November 1, 1977. Unlike the first 2 victims, Judith had no connection to prostitution. She was a high school student whose family expected her to return home, as she always had. Instead, days later, her body was discovered in a hillside area. Evidence indicated that she had been sexually assaulted before being strangled. Her murder shocked both investigators and the public because it demonstrated that the victims were not limited to one social group. Suddenly, every young woman traveling alone appeared vulnerable. Parents throughout Los Angeles began looking at ordinary routines differently. Walking home from school, waiting for a bus, or traveling alone after sunset no longer seemed like harmless parts of daily life. The murder of Judith Miller transformed fear into widespread panic because it suggested there was no clear way to predict who might be targeted next. That fear deepened only weeks later with the disappearance of 12-year-old Dolores Cepeda and 14-year-old Sonia Johnson. On November 20th, 1977, the 2 girls left home intending to see a movie. It was an ordinary outing that countless families would have considered safe. When they failed to return, their families reported them missing almost immediately. Days later, both girls were found together. Investigators determined that they had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Their deaths became among the most heartbreaking moments of the entire investigation. The fact that 2 children had vanished together and still could not escape their attackers intensified public outrage throughout Southern California. Families who had previously worried about teenagers now feared even for younger children. Parents became reluctant to allow sons and daughters to travel anywhere alone. Community discussions increasingly centered on personal safety rather than ordinary neighborhood concerns. Every new headline reinforced the sense that no one understood how the offender selected victims or when another attack might occur. The next confirmed victim, 20-year-old college student Christina Weckler, demonstrated once again that the offender or offenders showed no consistent preference regarding occupation or lifestyle. Weckler disappeared while traveling home. According to investigative records, her case contained some of the most severe physical abuse documented during the series. Investigators reported evidence that she had been beaten, injected with a cleaning solution, and ultimately strangled, although the exact details remained within official case files. The brutality of her murder left detectives increasingly convinced they were dealing with an exceptionally dangerous offender capable of escalating violence. Soon afterward, 28-year-old actress and model Evelyn Jane King became another victim. By the time her body was discovered, decomposition had progressed to the point that investigators could not determine every detail surrounding her final hours. Even so, her death added another name to the growing list of victims and further complicated attempts to establish a consistent victim profile. King differed in age and occupation from many of the others, once again frustrating investigators searching for a logical pattern. Then came 18-year-old Lauren Wagner. Her case would later become significant for a reason that investigators did not fully appreciate at the time. Witnesses reported seeing Wagner with two men before her disappearance. One appeared younger, while the other appeared considerably older. In retrospect, this observation offered one of the earliest clues that the Hillside Strangler might not have been one individual at all. Yet because investigators had already committed themselves to the theory of a lone serial killer, the information failed to alter the overall direction of the investigation. The possibility that two offenders could be working together remained outside the assumptions. Guiding much of the case, 17-year-old Kimberly Martin, another victim who worked as a sex worker, became one of the final victims during 1977. Her murder reminded investigators that although some victims shared similar backgrounds, others did not. Every attempt to define the offender through victim selection continued to collapse as additional evidence emerged. The final confirmed Los Angeles victim in the series was 20-year-old Cindy Hudspeth. In February 1978, her body was discovered inside the trunk of an abandoned vehicle. After her murder, something unexpected happened. The killings suddenly stopped. At the time, investigators had no explanation. Had the killer died? Been imprisoned for another crime? Left California? Or simply decided to stop? No one could answer those questions. The silence that followed offered little comfort because uncertainty remained. Detectives understood that serial offenders rarely abandon violence voluntarily. Yet without new murders, they had almost no opportunity to generate fresh evidence. Unknown to investigators, one of the offenders had indeed left Los Angeles. Kenneth Bianchi had moved to Bellingham, Washington, a decision that would eventually become the turning point in the entire investigation. But during those months, California authorities did not know that the apparent end of the murders coincided with his departure. Instead, they continued searching for a killer who no longer appeared to be active within the city. By early 1978, Los Angeles had changed. Women altered daily routines, avoided traveling alone after dark, and became wary not only of strangers, but even of individuals claiming to be police officers. Because investigators had learned that the offenders often approached victims by impersonating law enforcement. The abuse of that symbol of authority deeply affected public confidence. A police badge was supposed to represent protection. In this case, it had allegedly become a tool used to gain trust before committing unimaginable crimes. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Hillside Strangler case was not merely the number of victims, but the extraordinary variety of lives interrupted. Among the 10 women and girls were students, children, a college student, a model and actress, and women working in prostitution. They came from different backgrounds, different neighborhoods, and different stages of life. The only characteristic they truly shared was vulnerability in moments when they encountered individuals willing to exploit trust, isolation, and opportunity. Long before investigators uncovered the identities of Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr., these 10 victims had already reshaped an entire city's sense of security. Their deaths forced Los Angeles to confront uncomfortable truths about violence, public safety, and the dangers of assumptions that can mislead even experienced investigators. Before detectives would learn who the Hillside Stranglers really were, they first had to understand the men hidden behind the crimes. two cousins whose paths had converged in Los Angeles long before the city realized it was searching for more than one killer. Long before the name Hillside Strangler appeared across newspaper headlines. Before investigators assembled one of California's largest homicide task forces. And before fear spread through the streets of Los Angeles. Two lives had followed separate paths that would eventually converge with devastating consequences. The investigation would ultimately identify two cousins, Kenneth Alessio Bianchi and Angelo Anthony Buono Jr., as the men responsible for the murders that had terrorized Southern California between late 1977 and early 1978. Although history often remembers them together, they were very different individuals in age, background, and personality. Understanding who they were is not an attempt to excuse or sensationalize their crimes. Rather, it helps explain how investigators eventually uncovered the truth that the city had been searching for one killer, when, in reality, two men had been working together. Kenneth Alessio Bianchi was born on May 22, 1951, in Rochester, New York. He was adopted as an infant and grew up far from the California landscape that would later become synonymous with one of America's most notorious serial murder investigations. As a young adult, Bianchi drifted through a series of ordinary jobs. According to the available records, he worked as a security guard, a salesman, and in several other short-term positions. None of these occupations suggested that he would one day become the focus of an international criminal investigation. Yet those who later examined his background found a recurring characteristic that appeared throughout his adult life. Bianchi frequently lied about who he was. He presented himself as far more accomplished than reality allowed. At various times, he falsely claimed to be a psychologist, while on other occasions he represented himself as a police officer or someone connected to law enforcement. These fabricated identities were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of deception. He appeared eager to create an image of intelligence, authority, and professional success, even when none of those claims could withstand careful scrutiny. People who met Bianchi often described him as polite, articulate, and capable of making a favorable first impression. He knew how to carry on conversations comfortably and often appeared calm in social settings. Later investigators, however, concluded that beneath that ordinary exterior lay someone who manipulated others with remarkable ease. His repeated dishonesty demonstrated an ability to present whatever version of himself best suited the situation, making it difficult for acquaintances to distinguish between truth and fiction. In 1976, Bianchi made a decision that would alter the course of his life, and tragically, the lives of many others. He left New York and moved to Los Angeles, California, where he began living with his older cousin, Angelo Anthony Buono Jr., if Bianchi represented youth and carefully constructed appearances. Buono projected something entirely different. Born on October 5, 1934, also in Rochester, New York, Buono was 17 years older than Bianchi. Unlike his younger cousin, he had spent much of his life in California after relocating there at a young age. By the time Bianchi arrived in Los Angeles, Buono had established himself as the owner of an automobile upholstery business in Glendale. On the surface, he appeared to be a businessman operating a legitimate enterprise. Yet his history revealed a far more troubling picture. Prior to the Hillside Strangler murders, Buono already possessed a criminal record involving violent and sexual offenses. Those who worked near his upholstery shop or knew him socially frequently described him as controlling, aggressive, and intimidating, particularly in his interactions with women. Unlike Bianchi, whose deceptive charm often concealed his intentions, Buono reportedly displayed a volatile personality that many found unsettling. The contrast between the two cousins was striking. One relied heavily on manipulation, fabricated identities, and the appearance of respectability. The other carried a reputation for anger and dominance that preceded him. Despite these differences, their lives became closely connected after Bianchi's arrival in California. Buono offered his younger cousin a place to stay, providing him with both housing and a connection to life in Los Angeles. At the time, nothing publicly suggested that the arrangement would become the foundation for one of the state's most infamous criminal partnerships. Years later, after his arrest, Bianchi described the period of living with Buono in considerable detail. According to his statements to investigators and prosecutors, the cousins spent significant amounts of time discussing women. Bianchi claimed that Buono exerted considerable influence over him and encouraged increasingly criminal behavior. He further alleged that the two regularly drove through Los Angeles together during the evenings, searching for potential victims. These statements would become central to the prosecution's theory once the investigation expanded beyond a single offender. However, it is equally important to recognize that these allegations came from Bianchi after he had entered negotiations with prosecutors. During subsequent legal proceedings, Angelo Buono categorically rejected every accusation made against him by his cousin. He insisted that Bianchi fabricated the story to secure favorable treatment and avoid the death penalty. This disagreement became one of the defining conflicts of the later trials. Prosecutors argued that Bianchi's testimony was supported by additional evidence and witness accounts, while Buono maintained that he was being falsely implicated by a man seeking to save himself. The court ultimately rejected Buono's defense, but the dispute illustrates how the investigation evolved from searching for one unknown murderer into unraveling the complex relationship between two men connected by both family ties and criminal accusations. According to the investigative findings presented after Bianchi's cooperation, the cousins developed a method of approaching victims that relied heavily on deception rather than immediate force. Instead of simply attacking women in isolated locations, they allegedly exploited one of society's most powerful symbols of trust, the authority of law enforcement. Using their own vehicle, they reportedly carried fake police badges or items resembling official police identification. They would approach women who were alone, often during evening hours, and present themselves as police officers conducting an investigation or checking identification. The strategy depended on surprise and perceived legitimacy. Most citizens instinctively comply when approached by someone appearing to be a police officer. Investigators later concluded that this false sense of authority allowed the offenders to gain control of victims without immediately attracting attention. Once the women entered the vehicle, according to the case records, they were taken either to Buono's residence or to his upholstery shop in Glendale. What happened afterward became the basis for multiple murder charges during the trials that followed. After the crimes, investigators determined that the bodies were abandoned across various hillside locations around Los Angeles, a pattern that ultimately inspired the media's now famous nickname, the Hillside Strangler. Even this disposal method reflected a calculated effort to complicate the investigation. By leaving victims in different areas, the offenders reduced the likelihood that investigators would immediately recognize a consistent geographic pattern. During the months when the murders continued, detectives possessed almost none of this information. They knew only that women from dramatically different backgrounds were disappearing and later being found dead in scattered locations. They did not know the names Kenneth Bianchi or Angelo Buono. They did not know about the cousins' living arrangement. They did not know about the alleged use of fake police badges. Most importantly, they remained convinced that they were pursuing a lone serial killer. This assumption shaped nearly every aspect of the investigation. Evidence was interpreted through the expectation that one offender had committed every crime. Witness statements that seemed inconsistent with a single individual often received less attention than they might have otherwise. One particularly significant example involved witnesses connected to the disappearance of 18-year-old Lauren Wagner. Some reported seeing her with two men before she vanished, one appearing younger and the other noticeably older. In hindsight, those observations fit remarkably well with what investigators would later learn about Bianchi and Buono. Yet at the time, the possibility that two offenders were operating together appeared less convincing than the already established theory of one serial murderer. As a result, one of the investigation's most important clues remained largely unrecognized until much later. By the beginning of 1978, Los Angeles remained trapped in uncertainty. The public knew only the frightening nickname invented by the press. Detectives continued examining evidence collected from multiple crime scenes while attempting to identify one elusive predator. Meanwhile, the two cousins who would eventually stand at the center of one of California's longest and most complex murder prosecutions continued to avoid identification. The city believed it was hunting a single shadow moving through the night. In reality, the truth was far more complicated, and before investigators would uncover their identities, the murders themselves would continue. Each new victim pushing Los Angeles deeper into fear, while the hidden partnership behind the crimes remained invisible. By the autumn of 1977, Los Angeles had become the stage for a series of crimes that investigators struggled to connect and even more struggled to understand. At the center of the mystery was a method that relied less on speed or surprise than on deception. According to the investigation that would later unfold, Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr. did not simply wait for victims in isolated places. Instead, they allegedly exploited one of the strongest instincts most people possess: the tendency to trust someone who appears to represent authority. Their approach was calculated. Using a private vehicle, they reportedly carried fake police badges or objects that closely resembled official identification. They drove through different parts of Los Angeles during the evening, searching for women who were alone. A woman walking home, waiting for transportation, or traveling by herself could suddenly find a vehicle stopping nearby. The men would present themselves as law enforcement officers, claiming they needed to ask questions, verify identification, or investigate a possible violation. For many people, especially during the 1970s, refusing the instructions of someone who appeared to be a police officer would have seemed both unusual and risky. That false appearance of legitimacy gave the offenders an opportunity to gain control before victims fully understood the danger. According to the later findings of investigators, once the victims entered the vehicle, they were taken either to Angelo Buono's residence or to his automobile upholstery business in Glendale. There, the victims were restrained, sexually assaulted, physically abused, and ultimately killed by strangulation. Investigators also concluded that after the murders, efforts were made to remove or reduce physical evidence before the bodies were transported away from the primary crime scene. Instead of leaving victims where the attacks occurred, the offenders abandoned the bodies across remote hillside areas surrounding Los Angeles. This decision complicated the investigation considerably. Each recovery site became a separate crime scene, making it difficult to reconstruct movements or determine where the murders had actually taken place. The repeated discovery of victims in hillside locations eventually inspired the media to create the name that would become infamous across the United States: the Hillside Strangler. The first victim later connected to the series was 19-year-old Yolanda Washington. She disappeared on October 16, 1977. Washington worked as a sex worker, and when her body was discovered near Ventura Boulevard, investigators initially believed the crime reflected violence directed specifically toward women involved in prostitution. Such crimes, while no less tragic, were often investigated within a narrower context because detectives look for disputes involving clients, acquaintances, or others connected to that environment. At this early stage, there was little indication that Washington's murder represented the beginning of a much larger series. Her death was devastating for those who knew her, but investigators did not yet realize they were witnessing the opening chapter of a prolonged murder investigation that would soon dominate headlines throughout California. Only 2 weeks later, another young woman disappeared. Rosamond Williams, 24 years old and also working as a sex worker, was later found dead near a highway. The similarities between her death and that of Yolanda Washington naturally attracted investigators' attention. Both victims belonged to the same vulnerable profession, and both had been strangled before their bodies were abandoned outdoors. Detectives increasingly suspected they were searching for a serial offender whose victims shared similar lifestyles. Although the investigation remained in its early stages, the working theory seemed logical based on the available evidence. Unfortunately, the next murder shattered that assumption entirely. On November 1st, 1977, 15-year-old Judith Miller disappeared after leaving school. Unlike the previous victims, Judith had no connection to prostitution. She was simply a high school student expected to return home after classes, as she had done countless times before. When she failed to arrive, concern quickly turned into alarm. Days later, her body was discovered in a hillside area. Investigators determined that she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Judith Miller's murder marked a profound turning point in the case. The belief that the offender exclusively targeted sex workers could no longer be supported. The victim profile had expanded dramatically, and with it came an entirely new level of fear throughout Los Angeles. Families realized that ordinary routines, walking home from school, traveling alone, or spending time outside without companions, might expose young women to extraordinary danger. Detectives now faced a far more difficult challenge because the pool of potential victims appeared almost limitless. If occupation no longer explained the offender's choices, what did? Before investigators could answer that question, tragedy struck again. On November 20th, 1977, 12-year-old Dolores Cepeda and 14-year-old Sonia Johnson left home together to see a movie. It was the kind of ordinary afternoon that countless families experienced every weekend. Two friends planned to enjoy a film before returning home later that day. Instead, they disappeared. Their families reported them missing as soon as it became clear something was terribly wrong. For days there were no answers. Then both girls were found together. Investigators concluded that they had been sexually assaulted and strangled before their bodies were abandoned. Their murders produced one of the strongest emotional reactions of the entire investigation. Until then, many residents had believed the victims were primarily young adults. The deaths of Dolores and Sonia destroyed any remaining sense of security. The victims were children. Parents across Los Angeles became increasingly unwilling to allow sons or daughters to travel independently. Community meetings, school discussions, and neighborhood conversations focused almost entirely on personal safety. Fear was no longer confined to those who traveled alone at night. It entered ordinary homes, classrooms, and family routines. As the number of victims increased, the pressure on investigators intensified. Detectives revisited earlier assumptions, searching desperately for some characteristic linking all the victims. Yet each new homicide seemed only to complicate the picture further. The ages varied widely. Their occupations differed. Some knew one another only through the circumstances of their deaths. Others had no apparent connection at all. The only obvious pattern remained the manner in which their lives ended and the isolated hillside, locations where their bodies were ultimately discovered. Meanwhile, the offender's reported use of fake police identification added another disturbing dimension to the investigation. If women willingly entered a vehicle believing they were cooperating with legitimate law enforcement officers, there might be few witnesses able to recognize an abduction in progress. To anyone observing from a distance, the interaction could appear entirely routine. A police officer speaking with a citizen would not necessarily attract attention or suspicion. This possibility explained why so many disappearances occurred without immediate signs of struggle. In public places, it also introduced a terrifying new concern for the public. Confidence in visible authority had become vulnerable to exploitation. Women who previously would have felt reassured by the presence of a police officer now faced an impossible question. How could they distinguish between genuine authority and someone merely pretending to possess it? Investigators continued collecting evidence from every recovery site, documenting forensic findings, interviewing witnesses, and comparing details among the growing number of cases. Despite these efforts, the murders continued. The investigation expanded, but answers remained elusive. Detectives still believed they were hunting one exceptionally dangerous offender whose victim selection appeared increasingly unpredictable. They could not yet imagine that the truth involved two individuals acting together. Looking back, the first half of the Hillside Strangler murders illustrates how dangerous assumptions can become during a complex criminal investigation. The initial belief that only sex workers were at risk delayed recognition of the broader threat. The assumption that one offender committed every crime influenced how witness testimony was evaluated. Each new victim forced investigators to revise earlier conclusions. But every revision consumed valuable time, while the offenders remained unidentified. By the close of 1977, Los Angeles had already lost multiple young women and girls. The city no longer viewed the murders as isolated tragedies, but as part of a continuing campaign of violence that showed no sign of ending. Every new day, without an arrest, heightened anxiety, while every fresh discovery deepened the realization that whoever stood behind the name Hillside Strangler possessed both patience and an alarming ability to avoid detection. Unknown to investigators, however, one of the most important clues had already begun to emerge, not from forensic evidence or laboratory analysis, but from witnesses whose observations hinted that the city might not be searching for one killer after all. By the closing weeks of 1977, Los Angeles was living under a cloud of uncertainty unlike anything the city had experienced in years. Each new victim forced investigators to reconsider theories they had formed only days earlier. While residents struggled to understand how someone could continue committing such devastating crimes without leaving behind enough evidence to be identified, the investigation had already established that the offender was capable of selecting victims from remarkably different backgrounds. But the murders that followed only deepened the mystery. Rather than revealing a clearer pattern, each case added another layer of complexity, making it increasingly difficult for detectives to predict who might be targeted next or how the offender chose his victims. One of the next confirmed victims was 20-year-old Christina Weckler, a college student. According to the investigation, she disappeared while traveling home, an ordinary journey that should have ended safely. Instead, her case became one of the most disturbing in the series because of the severity of the abuse documented during the forensic examination. Investigators reported evidence that she had been physically assaulted and injected with a cleaning solution before ultimately being strangled. The findings demonstrated an extraordinary level of violence and cruelty. For detectives, the case reinforced the belief that they were searching for an offender whose crimes appeared to be escalating in brutality. Every new forensic report required investigators to compare details with previous cases, looking for similarities that might establish a consistent behavioral pattern. Although the methods shared important characteristics, they still failed to answer the central question that haunted the task force: who was responsible? Christina Weckler's death also reminded investigators that the victims no longer fit any narrow demographic profile. She was a university student with an entirely different background from the women whose murders had initially shaped the investigation. The assumption that occupation or lifestyle determined victim selection had already collapsed after earlier murders. And Weckler's case further emphasized that almost any woman alone could potentially become a target. This realization spread rapidly through Los Angeles. Students became more cautious when traveling to and from campuses. Families encouraged daughters to avoid walking alone whenever possible. Routines that had once seemed harmless were now viewed through the lens of fear. Soon afterward, another victim's name was added to the growing list. Evelyn Jane King, 28 years old, worked as both an actress and a model. Her disappearance reflected once again how widely the victims differed from one another. When her body was eventually discovered, decomposition had progressed so far that investigators could not determine every detail of what had occurred during her final hours. Even so, the available evidence allowed detectives to connect her death to the same series of murders already terrorizing Southern California. King's occupation attracted considerable media attention because she represented another completely different segment of society. The victims now included sex workers, students, children, and someone involved in the entertainment industry. Each addition to the list further undermined any hope that detectives could identify the offender by focusing on a specific category of victim. The investigation increasingly suggested that opportunity and vulnerability mattered more than profession, social status, or age. Yet perhaps the most significant development during this period came through the case of 18-year-old Lauren Wagner. At first glance, her disappearance resembled those that had come before it. Another young woman vanished, leaving investigators to prepare for the possibility that another body would soon be discovered. But unlike several previous cases, Lauren's disappearance produced an observation that would later become one of the investigation's most important clues. Witnesses reported seeing her with two men before she disappeared. According to those accounts, one man appeared noticeably younger, while the other was significantly older. At the time, these statements did not fundamentally alter the direction of the investigation. Detectives had already devoted enormous resources to identifying a single serial killer. Every major theory, every investigative strategy, and much of the public messaging centered on the assumption that one offender operated alone. As a result, witness descriptions involving two men did not immediately transform the overall understanding of the case. Looking back, however, those observations appear remarkably important. Years later, after Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr. had been identified, investigators recognized that the witnesses had likely provided one of the earliest indications that the Hillside Strangler was not one individual at all. One younger man, one older man. Those descriptions closely matched the relationship between the two cousins. Yet, during the active investigation, this possibility remained overshadowed by the dominant belief that serial murder was almost always the work of a lone offender. It serves as a reminder that investigations are often shaped not only by evidence, but also by the assumptions investigators bring to that evidence. Sometimes the truth is visible long before it is understood. As 1977 approached its conclusion, another young victim was identified. 17-year-old Kimberly Martin worked as a sex worker, bringing the investigation in some ways back to where it had begun. Her murder reminded detectives that although the offender had expanded beyond one victim category, women involved in prostitution continued to face exceptional danger. The combination of victims from widely different backgrounds complicated every attempt to anticipate future attacks. Detectives could no longer issue warnings directed toward one specific community because the murders had demonstrated that vulnerability could exist almost anywhere. Every woman traveling alone after dark now appeared to face an uncertain level of risk. Throughout Los Angeles, ordinary life changed in response to that uncertainty. Women increasingly avoided walking alone during the evening. Friends arranged transportation together instead of traveling separately. Families insisted that daughters telephone immediately after arriving home safely. Businesses employing women on late shifts became more conscious of employee safety. Public transportation, once viewed simply as a convenient necessity, became another source of anxiety because riders could not always know who might be waiting nearby. Perhaps one of the most unsettling consequences involved public confidence in law enforcement. According to the investigation, the offenders frequently approached victims while pretending to be police officers by displaying fake badges or similar objects. That tactic transformed an everyday symbol of safety into a source of fear. Normally, encountering a police officer would reassure someone facing uncertainty. In this case, investigators believed that false authority had become one of the offender's most effective weapons. Women began questioning whether they could immediately trust someone identifying himself as law enforcement if circumstances seemed unusual. The emotional impact of that uncertainty extended far beyond the individual crimes themselves. It affected countless encounters between citizens and genuine police officers, placing an invisible strain on relationships built upon public trust. The final confirmed Los Angeles victim in the series was 20-year-old Cindy Hudspeth. In February 1978, her body was discovered inside the trunk of an abandoned vehicle. The circumstances once again reflected the offender's apparent efforts to complicate the investigation by separating the location where the crime occurred from the place where the victim was eventually found. Detectives processed another crime scene, collected additional evidence, interviewed more witnesses, and continued searching for connections that might finally reveal the identity of the Hillside Strangler. Then something unexpected happened. The murders stopped. Days passed without another disappearance. Then weeks. Investigators remained cautious because serial offenders sometimes pause between crimes. But as time continued to pass without another confirmed victim in Los Angeles, uncertainty replaced urgency. No one understood why the killings had suddenly ended. Detectives considered numerous possibilities. Had the offender died? Had he been arrested for another crime under a different identity? Was he injured, imprisoned, or simply waiting before attacking again? None of those questions had convincing answers. What investigators did not yet know was that Kenneth Bianchi had left California for Bellingham, Washington. His departure effectively ended the Los Angeles murders, though the reason would remain hidden until much later. To detectives at the time, the silence offered no explanation. They continued working an enormous investigation involving more than 160 personnel, thousands of leads, and 10 murdered victims, still believing they were searching for one elusive killer. The city remained uneasy despite the absence of new crimes because no arrest had been made. Families of the victims still had no justice. Residents understood that the person responsible remained free. Every unexplained pause carried the possibility that another murder might occur at any moment. In retrospect, this period marked the final chapter of the Hillside Strangler murders in Los Angeles before the investigation took an unexpected turn hundreds of miles away. The city believed the trail had gone cold. In reality, the crimes had not truly ended. One of the offenders had simply crossed state lines, carrying with him the methods that had already devastated Los Angeles. That decision, invisible to California investigators at the time, would ultimately provide the break that years of searching had failed to produce and would begin unraveling one of the most complex serial murder investigations in American history. As the murders continued through late 1977 and into early 1978, the investigation grew into one of the largest and most demanding homicide inquiries California had undertaken at the time. Every new victim brought fresh urgency. Yet every new crime scene also revealed how difficult the search would become. Detectives were no longer investigating isolated homicides. They were confronting what increasingly appeared to be the work of a serial offender whose methods combined careful planning, deception, and an ability to leave remarkably little evidence behind. The challenge facing law enforcement was immense, made even greater by the technological limitations of the era. Decades before DNA profiling transformed criminal investigations, detectives depended primarily on physical evidence, fingerprints, witness interviews, forensic examinations, and painstaking investigative work. Each clue had to be collected, compared, and interpreted without many of the scientific tools that later generations would consider routine. The investigation demanded patience, coordination, and persistence. Yet progress remained frustratingly slow. As additional bodies were recovered from different hillside locations around Los Angeles, investigators recognized similarities that suggested the murders were connected. Victims had been strangled. Many had been sexually assaulted. Their bodies had been abandoned in remote areas rather than left where the crimes themselves had likely occurred. Nevertheless, those similarities did not immediately reveal the identity of the offender. Instead, they raised difficult questions. Why were the bodies being left in different locations? Was the killer deliberately attempting to confuse investigators? Or did those sites hold some personal significance? Detectives searched for geographical patterns, hoping the disposal locations might reveal where the offender lived, worked, or traveled regularly. Unfortunately, the scattered recovery sites produced few reliable answers. Each body effectively created another crime scene separated from the actual location where the victim had been attacked, multiplying the amount of evidence that required examination while offering little indication of where the murders themselves had taken place. One of the greatest obstacles confronting investigators was the absence of modern DNA technology. Biological evidence that today might rapidly identify or eliminate suspects could not provide the same answers during the late 1970s. Detectives instead relied heavily upon fingerprint comparisons whenever recoverable prints existed. Yet according to the investigation, the fingerprints obtained failed to match anyone already contained within available law enforcement databases. That left detectives without one of the strongest forms of identification then available. Every unsuccessful comparison represented another dead end, forcing investigators to continue searching through interviews, surveillance, and traditional detective work rather than scientific certainty. Witness testimony became another critical element of the investigation. Detectives interviewed family members, co-workers, friends, neighbors, and anyone believed to have encountered the victims before they disappeared. Every recollection mattered, even seemingly insignificant observations. Someone might remember a vehicle parked unusually close to a bus stop, a conversation overheard in passing, or a stranger whose behavior seemed unusual only in hindsight. Thousands of interviews gradually accumulated into an enormous collection of investigative material. Yet separating meaningful information from mistaken memories and unrelated observations proved extraordinarily difficult. High-profile cases inevitably generate rumors alongside genuine leads, and the Hillside Strangler investigation was no exception. As media coverage expanded, police received an overwhelming number of tips from members of the public. Some callers believed they had seen the suspect. Others reported suspicious neighbors, unfamiliar vehicles, or incidents that appeared connected. Every lead required evaluation because investigators could not risk overlooking information that might identify the offender. The result was an enormous investigative workload. More than 160 investigators ultimately became involved in the effort, reflecting both the seriousness of the crimes and the immense complexity of the case. Teams reviewed reports, compared timelines, examined forensic findings, and attempted to establish links between victims who, on the surface, seemed to have little in common beyond the manner of their deaths. The media also played a significant role in shaping public understanding of the investigation. Because many victims were discovered on hillsides surrounding Los Angeles, journalists adopted the name Hillside Strangler. The nickname quickly spread throughout newspapers and television broadcasts, giving the unknown offender a single identity long before investigators understood the full truth. While the name helped the public recognize that the murders were connected, it also reinforced the widespread assumption that one individual was responsible. That assumption was shared not only by the public, but by much of the investigative effort itself. Detectives organized evidence around the expectation that they were searching for one serial murderer. Looking back, this belief became one of the investigation's most significant limitations. Witnesses connected to the disappearance of Lauren Wagner had reported seeing two men, one younger and one older. In hindsight, those observations aligned remarkably well with what investigators would later discover about Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr. at the time. However, the concept of two offenders working together did not fit comfortably within prevailing theories about serial homicide. As a result, information suggesting multiple perpetrators failed to reshape the investigation as dramatically as it might have otherwise. This was not the product of negligence, but rather the consequence of interpreting evidence through an assumption that seemed reasonable based on contemporary understanding. The investigation therefore illustrates how even experienced detectives can be influenced by expectations established early in a case. Public fear intensified as the investigation stretched from weeks into months without an arrest. Women altered daily routines in ways that reflected the uncertainty surrounding the murders. Many refused to travel alone after dark. Friends accompanied one another to work, school, or public transportation. Families established stricter expectations regarding communication and travel. Parents who had once allowed children considerable independence now worried about even ordinary activities. The alleged use of fake police badges by the offenders added another disturbing dimension to that. Fear. If the victims had entered vehicles believing they were interacting with legitimate police officers, then one of society's strongest symbols of safety had effectively been turned into a weapon. Residents found themselves confronting an unsettling possibility. Appearances alone could no longer guarantee trust. Meanwhile, investigators continued searching for the individual they believed responsible. Every recovered body underwent forensic examination. Detectives carefully documented injuries, compared methods of strangulation, reviewed evidence from disposal sites, and attempted to reconstruct each victim's final known movements. Despite these efforts, the offender consistently avoided leaving enough evidence to establish a clear identity. No witness could provide a complete description that led directly to a suspect. Fingerprint comparisons produced no breakthrough. The lack of DNA technology prevented additional forms of identification that modern investigators might have relied upon. The sheer number of investigative tasks threatened to overwhelm available resources despite the unusually large team assigned to the case. Then, as unexpectedly as the murders had begun, they stopped. Following the death of Cindy Hudspeth in February 1978, no additional victims matching the Hillside Strangler pattern appeared in Los Angeles. Detectives remained cautious. Serial offenders sometimes paused between crimes, making it impossible to conclude that the threat had ended. Surveillance continued. Leads were still pursued. Evidence was reviewed repeatedly in hopes that some overlooked detail might reveal the identity of the unknown killer. Yet weeks passed without another homicide connected to the series. The silence puzzled investigators almost as much as the murders themselves. They explored countless possibilities. Perhaps the offender had died. Perhaps he had been arrested elsewhere for an unrelated crime. Perhaps illness or injury had interrupted the pattern. Another possibility was that the offender had simply left Southern California. Without knowing the offender's identity, every theory remained speculative. Unknown to investigators, one explanation was correct. Kenneth Bianchi had relocated to Bellingham, Washington. His departure from California coincided with the sudden end of the Los Angeles murders. At the time, however, no connection existed between that move and the unsolved investigation dominating Southern California. Detectives had no reason to focus their attention hundreds of miles away because they did not yet know whom they were searching for. The apparent disappearance of the Hillside Strangler, therefore, remained one of the investigation's greatest mysteries. The case seemed frozen in place despite extraordinary efforts by law enforcement. Families still awaited justice. The public continued living with uncertainty. Detectives possessed thousands of pages of reports, but no suspect capable of explaining them. Yet the investigation was far from over. While California searched unsuccessfully for a killer who seemed to have vanished, events in Washington state were quietly setting the stage for the breakthrough that would finally expose the truth. A move intended to begin a new chapter for one of the offenders would instead become the mistake that unraveled everything, transforming one of America's most frustrating serial murder investigations into a case that would eventually reveal not one Hillside Strangler, but two. By the spring of 1978, something unusual had happened in Los Angeles. After months of fear, constant headlines, and the discovery of 10 victims connected to the Hillside Strangler investigation, the murders abruptly stopped. Detectives remained cautious, refusing to believe that the unknown offender had simply abandoned his crimes. Serial murder investigations had taught law enforcement that long periods of silence could be deceptive. An offender might pause for weeks or even months before attacking again. For that reason, investigators continued reviewing evidence, following leads, and waiting for the next development. What they did not know was that the explanation for the sudden silence was not hidden somewhere in Southern California. It had already traveled hundreds of miles north. Kenneth Alessio Bianchi had left Los Angeles and relocated to Bellingham, Washington. To the people around him, the move appeared ordinary enough. Friends believed he wanted a fresh start and an opportunity to build a different life away from California. Nothing about the relocation publicly suggested that it carried any connection to one of the country's largest unsolved serial murder investigations. The Hillside Strangler case remained active in Los Angeles, but Bianchi's name had not yet appeared in the investigation. As far as California authorities were concerned, they were still searching for an unidentified killer whose crimes had mysteriously ended. Unknown to them, one of the men they sought had quietly crossed state lines. Unfortunately, the move did not mark the end of violence. According to the investigation, after arriving in Washington, Bianchi resumed the same pattern that had already left so many families grieving in California. Two women, Janice Marie Chapman and Diane Wilder, were murdered using methods that investigators would later recognize as strikingly similar to the Los Angeles cases. At the time, however, authorities in Washington initially approached the crimes as local homicide investigations. There was no immediate reason to conclude that the offender might be connected to an infamous series. Hundreds of miles away, law enforcement agencies in different states often face practical challenges when attempting to compare active investigations, particularly during an era long before integrated digital databases and rapid information sharing became commonplace. The similarities between the Washington murders and the California cases would only become clear after later developments drew investigators' attention to Bianchi himself. The breakthrough that had eluded more than 160 investigators in California did not begin with advanced forensic science or a forgotten piece of physical evidence. Instead, it emerged through an event that unfolded almost by chance. On January 11, 1979, Bianchi invited two female college students to his residence. According to the investigation, he offered them what appeared to be an opportunity related to work. The invitation itself did not initially appear suspicious. It seemed like an ordinary meeting, one that countless people accept every day without hesitation. Yet what began as a seemingly routine encounter quickly became the turning point in one of America's most notorious murder investigations. During the incident, one of the two women managed to escape. That single act of survival changed everything. She was able to reach safety and alert the police, providing authorities with immediate reason to respond. For the first time, investigators were no longer searching for an unknown offender hidden somewhere within a massive population. They had a specific location, a specific suspect, and a situation requiring immediate action. Police quickly arrested Kenneth Bianchi. At first glance, the arrest appeared connected only to events unfolding in Washington. Yet, as detectives began examining his background, they noticed troubling similarities between the crimes under investigation and the still unsolved Hillside Strangler murders in California. The methods were difficult to ignore. The selection of female victims, the manner in which they were controlled, the sexual assaults, and the use of strangulation all echoed details that investigators in Los Angeles had been studying for months. Those similarities prompted authorities to look far more closely at Bianchi's past. What they discovered would dramatically alter the direction of both investigations. For California detectives, the news from Washington represented something they had desperately needed for nearly 2 years: a viable suspect. Until then, the Hillside Strangler had existed only as an unidentified figure assembled from witness statements, forensic reports, and speculation. Suddenly, investigators had an individual whose alleged actions appeared consistent with the crimes that had terrorized Los Angeles. Communication between investigators became increasingly important as authorities compared case files, timelines, and investigative findings. Each comparison revealed additional parallels that were becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence One detail stood out immediately. The Los Angeles murders had ended shortly after Bianchi left California. To investigators who had spent months wondering why the killings suddenly stopped, that timing now appeared highly significant. Although timing alone could never prove guilt, it offered a logical explanation that previously had not existed. The apparent disappearance of the Hillside Strangler was not because the offender had died or voluntarily abandoned violence. Instead, one of the individuals responsible had simply moved to another state. The silence in Los Angeles was therefore not the end of the crimes, but merely the result of geographic relocation. Investigators now began examining Bianchi's connections within California more carefully. During this process, attention eventually turned toward his relationship with Angelo Anthony Buono Jr., the older cousin with whom Bianchi had lived after moving from New York in 1976. At this stage, however, authorities still needed far more evidence before drawing conclusions regarding Buono's possible involvement. The immediate priority remained establishing Bianchi's role in the Washington murders and determining whether sufficient evidence connected him to the Hillside Strangler investigation. As questioning continued, Bianchi initially denied the allegations against him. Like many criminal investigations, the first phase of interrogation produced resistance rather than confession. Detectives carefully confronted him with available evidence while continuing to compare his statements against known facts. The process required patience. Experienced investigators understood that suspects often altered their accounts gradually rather than admitting responsibility immediately. Every inconsistency, every contradiction, and every unexplained detail became important. The arrest also highlighted an important lesson about serial crime investigations. For months, California authorities had invested extraordinary resources into identifying an unknown offender within Los Angeles. More than 160 investigators had reviewed thousands of leads without success. Ultimately, however, the decisive breakthrough came not because investigators discovered hidden evidence within California, but because the offender allegedly continued committing crimes elsewhere. Had Bianchi truly begun a completely different life after leaving Los Angeles, the Hillside Strangler investigation might have remained unsolved for far longer. Instead, the continuation of violent behavior created new opportunities for law enforcement to identify and apprehend him. Even after Bianchi's arrest, however, many of the investigation's biggest questions remained unanswered. Detectives still believed they might be dealing with one offender responsible for the California murders. Witnesses had occasionally described two men, but that possibility had never become central to the investigation. Authorities had not yet uncovered the full story behind the partnership that prosecutors would later describe in court. Nor had they heard the explanation Bianchi himself would soon offer in an extraordinary attempt to avoid criminal responsibility. As investigators intensified their questioning, Bianchi abandoned straightforward denials and adopted an entirely different strategy, one that would capture national attention, divide expert opinion during its early stages, and become one of the most famous examples of an accused murderer attempting to escape responsibility through claims of mental illness. His next statements would shift the investigation away from physical evidence and into the complex world of forensic psychology, where detectives, prosecutors, psychiatrists, and the courts would all be forced to confront an extraordinary claim that, if believed, could fundamentally change the outcome of one of America's most notorious serial murder cases. After his arrest in Washington, Kenneth Bianchi found himself facing a situation he could no longer easily control. For months, he had managed to remain outside the focus of investigators. The murders in Los Angeles had stopped after his departure, and he had moved to another state where his previous crimes were not immediately connected to him. But the deaths of Janice Marie Chapman and Diane Wilder changed that. The similarities between the Washington murders and the Hillside Strangler cases were too significant to ignore, and investigators began looking more closely at the man they had in custody. As the pressure increased, Bianchi changed his approach. rather than continuing to deny involvement. He introduced a new explanation, one that would become one of the most widely discussed elements of the entire case. He claimed that he was not fully responsible for the murders because another personality existed within him, a separate identity that committed the crimes without his conscious control. Bianchi claimed that he suffered from multiple personality disorder, now more commonly referred to as dissociative identity disorder. According to his story, the violent acts were committed by another personality rather than by Kenneth Bianchi himself. This claim immediately attracted attention because of its dramatic nature. The idea that a person could contain separate identities, with one responsible for crimes while another remained unaware, had already appeared in discussions of psychology and popular culture. For investigators and the public, however, the question was not whether such a condition existed in theory. The question was whether Bianchi actually suffered from it or whether he was creating a story designed to avoid responsibility. At first, his performance appeared convincing to some observers. Bianchi presented himself as confused and emotionally distressed. He described an internal struggle between himself and the alleged alternate personality responsible for the killings. Some mental health professionals who initially evaluated him approached the claim carefully, recognizing that psychiatric conditions could be complex and difficult to assess. His behavior created enough uncertainty that the possibility of genuine mental illness had to be examined seriously. A criminal investigation could not simply dismiss a claim of psychological disorder without proper evaluation. However, as more specialists examined Bianchi, serious questions began to emerge. Experts studying his statements and behavior discovered inconsistencies that suggested his condition might not be genuine. Investigators learned that Bianchi had previously studied topics related to hypnosis and psychological disorders. This discovery became particularly important because it suggested that he possessed knowledge that could help him construct a believable performance, rather than experiencing an uncontrollable alternate personality. Experts concluded that Bianchi had intentionally created a false identity in an attempt to escape criminal responsibility. The conclusion was devastating for investigators because it revealed another layer of deception from a man already known for manipulating others. Throughout his life, Bianchi had repeatedly created false versions of himself. He had claimed achievements and identities that were not true, presenting himself as someone more important or capable than reality suggested. The mental illness claim followed a similar pattern. According to the experts who evaluated him, it was another carefully constructed image designed to influence how others perceived him. The alleged alternate personality was not considered evidence of genuine psychological disorder but rather a strategy created by Bianchi himself. Once the claim was rejected, investigators returned their focus to the evidence connecting him to the murders. The question was no longer whether Bianchi was a helpless victim of another personality. The question became how much responsibility he carried and whether he had acted alone. As investigators continued questioning him, another major development occurred. Bianchi began providing information about Angelo Buono Jr., his older cousin and former roommate in Los Angeles. This was the moment when the Hillside Strangler investigation changed completely. For months, authorities had believed they were searching for one killer. Now, Bianchi was suggesting that another person had been involved. His statements introduced a new possibility. The crimes that had terrified Los Angeles were not committed by a single individual, but by two men working together. According to Bianchi's later claims, Buono played a central role in the murders. He stated that the two cousins had discussed women, selected victims together, and participated in the kidnappings, assaults, and killings. Bianchi portrayed Buono as the dominant figure in their relationship, suggesting that the older cousin influenced and encouraged his criminal behavior. These statements would become the foundation of the prosecution's case against Buono. However, the circumstances surrounding Bianchi's cooperation were complicated. He was not offering information without personal interest. Facing serious criminal charges himself, including the possibility of the death penalty. Bianchi had a powerful motivation to negotiate with prosecutors. By providing testimony against Buono, he hoped to receive a reduced sentence. This reality meant that investigators had to carefully evaluate every statement he made. A confession from a suspect attempting to save himself could not automatically be accepted as complete truth. Prosecutors needed additional support and evidence to determine whether Bianchi's accusations were accurate. For Angelo Buono, the accusations were devastating. He immediately rejected Bianchi's statements and claimed that his cousin had invented the story solely to protect himself. Buono argued that Bianchi was manipulating the legal system in the same way he had manipulated people throughout his life. According to Buono's defense, there was no reliable reason to believe a man who had already attempted to deceive investigators through a false mental illness claim. The conflict between the two cousins became one of the defining elements of the case. Each man attempted to portray the other as the true source of the crimes. Bianchi described himself as influenced by Buono. Buono described Bianchi as a liar willing to accuse anyone to avoid punishment. Determining where the truth ended and manipulation began became a major challenge for prosecutors. As investigators examined Bianchi's accusations, they also reviewed the existing evidence from the Los Angeles murders. Witness accounts, particularly those describing two men connected to some victims, gained new significance. The earlier reports of a younger and older man being seen with Lauren Wagner suddenly appeared far more important than they had during the original investigation. What once seemed like an unusual detail now fit the possibility that two offenders had been operating together. The relationship between Bianchi and Buono also provided investigators with a possible explanation for the methods used in the crimes. Bianchi had moved to Los Angeles in 1976 and lived with Buono, who was 17 years older. According to the investigation, the two men had spent significant time together before the murders began. Their relationship, combined with Bianchi's statements, created a framework that prosecutors would later use to explain how the crimes were committed. In October 1979, Angelo Buono was arrested. The arrest represented the final major breakthrough in a case that had remained unresolved for nearly 2 years. The city that had once feared a single unknown predator now faced a much more disturbing reality. Two individuals had allegedly worked together to commit the crimes. The revelation changed how investigators, psychologists, and the public viewed the case. Serial murder was often associated with a lone offender operating in secrecy. The Hillside Stranglers case challenged that assumption by demonstrating how two people could combine their personalities, abilities, and opportunities to create a deadly partnership. Yet even after Buono's arrest, the legal battle was far from over. Prosecutors still had to prove his involvement in court. They had to rely not only on Bianchi's testimony, but also on other evidence capable of convincing a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense would attack Bianchi's credibility, pointing out his lies, his false psychological claims, and his personal motivation to reduce his own punishment. The prosecution would have to demonstrate that despite Bianchi's dishonesty, key parts of his account were supported by independent evidence. The coming trial would become one of the longest and most complex criminal proceedings in California history. It would examine not only the murders themselves, but also questions about manipulation, psychological deception, accomplice testimony, and the difficulty of proving crimes committed behind closed doors. The arrest of Angelo Buono finally provided investigators with a second name they had been searching for. But bringing him to justice would require years of legal struggle, during which every detail of the Hillside Strangler investigation would be examined under the intense pressure of a courtroom. The search for answers had ended. The fight to prove the truth was only beginning. The arrest of Angelo Anthony Buono Jr. in October 1979 marked a dramatic turning point in the Hillside Strangler investigation. For nearly 2 years, Law enforcement officials and the public had believed they were searching for a single individual responsible for the deaths of 10 women and girls in Los Angeles. The discovery that Kenneth Bianchi had not acted alone changed the entire understanding of the case. The image of one hidden predator moving through the city was replaced by something even more disturbing. Two men connected by family ties who were accused of working together to commit a series of murders that had brought fear to an entire region. Yet, identifying the suspects was only the beginning. The justice system now faced the far more difficult task of proving exactly what happened, who was responsible for each crime, and whether the testimony of one convicted murderer could be trusted when used against another. From the beginning, prosecutors understood that Kenneth Bianchi represented both their greatest opportunity and their greatest challenge. Without his cooperation, connecting Angelo Buono to the murders would be significantly more difficult. Bianchi had provided investigators with information about their relationship, their alleged actions, and the methods they used. He described Buono as the dominant figure in their partnership and claimed that the older cousin played a major role in planning and carrying out the crimes. However, Bianchi was also a deeply problematic witness. His history of deception was already established. He had lied about his background, created false identities, and attempted to avoid responsibility by claiming he suffered from multiple personality disorder. Any jury hearing his testimony would naturally question whether he was telling the truth or simply constructing another story to protect himself. This created the central problem for prosecutors. How could they use the testimony of someone who had repeatedly demonstrated that he was capable of manipulation? The answer was to examine whether Bianchi's statements matched other evidence collected during the investigation. Prosecutors could not rely solely on his words. They needed to demonstrate that important parts of his account were supported by facts outside his control. This included reviewing witness statements, forensic findings, and details from the original homicide investigation. One of the most significant aspects of Bianchi's testimony was the explanation it provided for evidence that had previously confused investigators. The possibility of two offenders helped make sense of witness accounts that had never fully matched. The theory of a lone killer. In particular, reports connected to Lauren Wagner's disappearance gained new importance. Witnesses had described seeing two men with her before she vanished, one younger and one older. During the original investigation, that information had not been enough to overturn the assumption that one offender was responsible. After Bianchi's arrest, however, it became a crucial detail supporting the idea that the crimes involved both cousins. The relationship between Bianchi and Buono also became an important focus. Investigators examined their history together after Bianchi moved from New York to California in 1976. Buono had provided Bianchi with a place to live, and the two spent considerable time together before the murders began. According to Bianchi's statements, their conversations and activities gradually developed into criminal behavior. Buono, however, rejected this entire account. He argued that Bianchi was not a victim of influence, but rather a person who had invented a story to escape the consequences of his own actions. This conflict between the two men became a battle over credibility. Each attempted to define the other as the true architect of the crimes. Bianchi portrayed himself as someone controlled by Buono. Buono portrayed Bianchi as a manipulative liar who would sacrifice anyone to save himself. The prosecution's challenge was to separate personal accusations from evidence. The trial of Angelo Buono became one of the most complex criminal proceedings in California history. The amount of evidence, the number of victims, and the conflicting statements from the accused created an enormous legal challenge. Every victim represented an individual tragedy, but the court also had to examine the larger pattern connecting the crimes. Prosecutors presented the case as a coordinated series of kidnappings, sexual assaults, and murders committed by two individuals working together. The defense, meanwhile, focused heavily on attacking Bianchi's reliability. The argument was straightforward. A man who had already lied about his identity and attempted to fake mental illness could not be trusted to provide accurate testimony against someone else. The court had to consider whether Bianchi's statements were motivated by truth or self-preservation. Despite these challenges, the prosecution continued building its case. They argued that while Bianchi was certainly deceptive, deception alone did not mean every statement he made was false. They emphasized that certain parts of his account aligned with information already known from the investigation. The existence of supporting details became essential in convincing the court that Bianchi's accusations against Buono contained elements of truth. The trial also highlighted broader questions about criminal partnerships. Traditionally, serial murder investigations often focused on a single offender acting alone. The Hillside Stranglers case forced investigators and the public to confront a different reality. Some of the most serious crimes can involve cooperation between multiple individuals. The ability of two people to combine their efforts created additional challenges for law enforcement, because each participant could potentially play a different role. One person might appear more dominant, while another might appear less involved. Determining responsibility required careful examination rather than relying on assumptions about personality or behavior. As the legal process continued, Kenneth Bianchi had already accepted responsibility for his own role in the crimes. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he agreed to plead guilty and testify against Buono. He received multiple life sentences and remained imprisoned. His agreement with prosecutors meant that the trial against Buono became the central legal battle over the Hillside Strangler murders. For the families of the victims, the years between the crimes and the trial represented a long period of uncertainty and pain. Each new legal development reopened memories of loved ones who had been lost. The victims were not merely names in an investigation file. They were daughters, students, friends, and family members whose lives ended because of the actions of two men. The court proceedings eventually brought more public attention to their stories, reminding people that behind the infamous nickname Hillside Strangler were 10 individual victims with their own identities and futures. In 1983, after years of legal proceedings, Angelo Buono was found guilty of murder and kidnapping charges. The conviction represented the conclusion of one of California's most closely followed criminal trials. The jury accepted the prosecution's argument that Buono had participated in the crimes and rejected the claim that he was simply the target of Bianchi's attempt to save himself. Buono was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The verdict ended the courtroom battle, but it did not erase the suffering caused by the murders. The families of the victims received a legal conclusion, but the loss they experienced could not be undone. The case remained a reminder of the devastating consequences of violence and manipulation. After sentencing, the two cousins followed very different paths within the prison system. Kenneth Bianchi remained incarcerated in Washington, continuing to serve multiple life sentences. Over the years, he repeatedly sought parole, but his requests were denied. Angelo Buono remained imprisoned in California until his death. On September 21, 2002, he died in prison from a heart attack at the age of 67. His death meant that he never left custody and never received the opportunity to return to society. The Hillside Stranglers case became one of the most studied criminal investigations in American history because it challenged many assumptions about serial murder. It demonstrated that a serial killing operation could involve two offenders rather than one. It showed how criminals could exploit public trust by pretending to represent authority. It revealed the difficulties investigators face when early assumptions shape the direction of an investigation. And it illustrated the complicated role of cooperating witnesses whose testimony may be both valuable and deeply questionable. Ultimately, the conviction of Angelo Buono and the imprisonment of Kenneth Bianchi brought a measure of justice after years of fear and uncertainty. But the legacy of the case remains connected first and foremost to the victims. Their names, their lives, and the families they left behind are the true center of the story. The investigation may be remembered because of the criminals who committed the acts, but the tragedy belongs to those who lost their lives and those who continued carrying the consequences long after the courtroom doors closed. The conclusion of the Hillside Stranglers case did not arrive with a single moment of discovery or a simple explanation. Instead, it came after years of investigation, legal battles, psychological examinations, and painful revelations that transformed a local tragedy into one of the most studied criminal cases in American history. When Angelo Buono was convicted in 1983 and Kenneth Bianchi remained imprisoned after accepting responsibility for his own crimes, the legal system had reached its final judgment. Two men had been identified, prosecuted, and punished. Yet the impact of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. The murders had changed the way investigators approached serial homicide, influenced public awareness of personal safety, and demonstrated the devastating consequences that can occur when violence is combined with deception and manipulation. At the heart of the case were 10 victims in Los Angeles whose lives ended between October 1977 and February 1978. Their ages ranged from 12 to 28. Their backgrounds were different. Some were students. Some were young women working in vulnerable circumstances. Some were connected to ordinary daily routines that should never have placed them in danger. What connected them was not a lifestyle, occupation, or personal history. What connected them was that they encountered two men who chose to commit acts of extreme violence. Remembering the Hillside Stranglers case requires looking beyond the nickname that dominated. Headlines. The phrase Hillside Strangler became widely known, but it represented a crime rather than the individuals whose lives were taken. Behind that label were Yolanda Washington, Rosamond Williams, Judith Miller, Dolores Cepeda, Sonia Johnson, Christina Weckler, Evelyn Jane King, Lauren Wagner, Kimberly Martin, and Cindy Hudspeth. Each victim had a personal story that existed before the investigation began. Each had family members and people who cared about them. The murders ended their futures, but they should not be remembered only through the circumstances of their deaths. The investigation itself revealed several important lessons about criminal justice. One of the most significant was the danger of relying too heavily on early assumptions. At the beginning of the investigation, detectives believed they were searching for a single offender. That belief was understandable because many serial murder cases involve one individual acting alone. However, in this case, the truth was more complicated. Two men had allegedly worked together, creating a situation that challenged traditional expectations about serial killers. The discovery that Bianchi and Buono were connected changed the entire understanding of the crimes. It forced investigators to reconsider evidence that had previously seemed confusing, especially witness accounts suggesting the presence of more than one man. The case demonstrated that investigators must remain open to possibilities that challenge their original theories. Another major lesson involved the use of deception. According to the investigation, Bianchi and Buono did not simply rely on physical force. One of their most disturbing tactics was allegedly pretending to represent law enforcement. By using false authority, they exploited a relationship that society depends upon, the trust between citizens and legitimate police officers. This aspect of the case created fear beyond the individual murders because it affected how people viewed encounters with authority figures. A symbol normally associated with protection had been turned into a tool of manipulation. The case also highlighted the difficulties involved in investigating crimes committed across different locations. The murders occurred throughout the Los Angeles area, and the victims' bodies were discovered at various hillside locations. Without modern forensic technology, investigators had to rely on traditional methods of collecting and comparing information. More than 160 investigators worked on the case, reviewing thousands of leads and attempting to connect evidence from multiple crime scenes. The investigation showed both the dedication of law enforcement and the enormous challenges faced. When technology is limited, the eventual breakthrough did not come from advanced scientific testing, but from the continuation of Criminal behavior. When Bianchi moved to Washington and became involved in additional murders, he created new opportunities for investigators to identify him. His actions outside California ultimately provided the connection that had been missing for so long. The case also became widely discussed because of Bianchi's attempt to claim a mental disorder as a defense. His claim that another personality was responsible for the murders became one of the most famous examples of an accused criminal attempting to use a psychological explanation to avoid responsibility. Mental health professionals examined the claim and concluded that Bianchi had fabricated the condition. The episode became an important example in discussions about forensic psychology because it demonstrated the need for careful evaluation of psychiatric claims in criminal cases. It also showed how psychological knowledge could potentially be misused by individuals attempting to manipulate the legal system. The relationship between Bianchi and Buono remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. The two men were relatives, yet their connection became associated with some of the most horrific crimes of the period. According to prosecutors, their partnership allowed them to commit crimes that neither might have carried out in the same way alone. The case therefore contributed to a broader understanding of criminal partnerships and how cooperation between offenders can create additional challenges for investigators. It also raised difficult questions about influence, responsibility, and the ways individuals may encourage one another to commit harmful acts. After his conviction, Angelo Buono spent the remainder of his life in prison. He died on September 21, 2002, from a heart attack while incarcerated at the age of 67. Kenneth Bianchi remained imprisoned in Washington, serving multiple life sentences. His repeated attempts to obtain parole were unsuccessful. Neither man returned to ordinary society. However, punishment alone could not restore what had been lost. For the families of the victims, the conclusion of the legal process did not represent the end of grief. Justice can establish accountability, but it cannot reverse tragedy. The passage of time does not erase the absence left behind when a loved one is taken away. The Hillside Stranglers case also influenced how future investigations viewed serial crimes. It reinforced the importance of cooperation between law enforcement agencies, especially when suspects may move between jurisdictions. It demonstrated the value of sharing information between states and examining similarities between cases that may initially appear unrelated. It also contributed to the development of behavioral analysis and the study of criminal patterns, helping investigators better understand how offenders select victims, conceal crimes, and attempt to avoid detection. Yet perhaps the most important reflection from this case is the reminder that every investigation begins and ends with human lives. Statistics, timelines, evidence reports, and courtroom arguments are necessary parts of the justice process, but they represent real people and real suffering. The victims of the Hillside Stranglers were not simply numbers in a criminal record. They were individuals with families, hopes, and futures that were taken away. Their stories deserve recognition separate from the actions of those who harmed them. The case remains infamous because of the crimes committed and the men responsible. But its deepest meaning lies in understanding the impact those crimes had on an entire community. Los Angeles experienced fear and uncertainty during those months, but the response also demonstrated determination. Investigators continued searching despite repeated failures. Families continued demanding answers despite years of waiting. The justice system continued working through an extraordinarily complex case. The eventual convictions represented the result of that persistence. More than 4 decades later, the Hillside Stranglers case continues to be studied because it contains many of the elements that define complex criminal investigations: deception, uncertainty, psychological manipulation, multiple offenders, and the search for truth in the aftermath of unimaginable loss. But beyond all of those elements remains a simple reality. 10 people lost their lives, and countless others were forever changed. The lasting responsibility is not only to remember the crimes, but to remember the victims whose lives existed before those crimes occurred. Their stories are the reason the investigation mattered, the reason justice was pursued, and the reason the Hillside Stranglers case continues to be remembered today.